الحوار التالي: مستقبل المنطقة المضطربة، إلى أين نحن متجهون؟ معالي السيد محمد الديري وزير الشؤون الخارجية والتعاون الدولي في ليبيا، الجنرال المتقاعد ديفيد بترايس، عضو ورئيس مجلس إدارة معهد KKR العالمي، الدكتور فيليب جوردن، منسق البيت الأبيض السابق للشرق الأوسط، سيغريد كاك المنسقة الخاصة للأمم المتحدة في لبنان، خالد عبد الله جناحي رئيس مجلس إدارة شركة نسيج ومجموعة سوليداريتي القابضة، وكريم ساتشبور الباحث الأول في برنامج الشرق الأوسط في مؤسسة كارنيجي للسلام الدولي، وأيضا باكي أندرسون مقدمة برنامج Connect the World الذي يعرض على قناة CNN International.
Thank you to the panel, and thank you, Regida, for the opportunity to have everybody here and thinking, not just talking, but thinking, I think, which is what's important. We are among friends, so you can be honest. Platitudes are generally not so useful.
The press has become friendly.
We've always been like that, you know us. We have heard some important and insightful analysis over the past, 24 hours or so of current events. I think it's clear that whichever way you spin the Rubik's Cube, it won't surprise anybody here that this is a region in turmoil. And unless policymakers today, quite frankly, start making some fairly creative decisions, coming up with some fairly creative solutions for tomorrow, this generation of leaders in this region is quite frankly failing the next generation. We've heard a lot of talk about youth here. I don't see that many people who are much younger than me, and that worries me slightly to a certain extent in the audience. Oh, you're younger than me, Regida, is that what you're saying? Good. Well, I'm glad, because I think that's important. And we've talked about women's empowerment and various other things. Let's make sure that those who are of the next generation are as well represented going forward as possible. I think any sense of future initiatives for peace, stability and economic prosperity in this region are all great, but ideas will have absolutely no value, I think we all agree, without stopping the bloodletting. I think the point of this summit is to provide some concrete solutions for policy action that will help provide this region with a strategic roadmap. So I do ask each of you on the panel here, through the prism of your respective experience and with the benefit and hindsight that your invaluable experience in geopolitics provides, to suggest at least one policy point out of this next hour that you think might help shape a more stable future. As I say, don't be polite. You are among friends, even though I am a member of the press. David Petraeus, General, let me start with you. President Obama is winding down America's involvement in the Arab world. Whatever their differences, Russia and Iran are filling that vacuum. We've had a lot of talk about Syria, a lot of analysis of Syria and Iraq over the past 24 hours. Let's start with Syria. Arabs and the West have, quite frankly, missed the opportunity to own the military context which might have prompted a diplomatic solution. So, what needs to happen next?
Well, first of all, if I could, gently, I would take issue with the fact that you say that the U.S. is winding down, or President Obama is winding down the U.S. presence in the region. I think we tried to wind down, frankly. And I think we've found that we've had to wind it back up. We withdrew our combat forces from Iraq, left a small training security assistance element that's now back up into the thousands, with many thousands more in the region, helping to carry out the coalition effort that is focused on the Islamic State and the extremism that they have demonstrated so barbarically. So I think in that sense there was a reassessment, and in fact that has been ramped back up. I suspect there will be a bit more of that, frankly. You've heard my testimony on Capitol Hill of the Senate Armed Services Committee about some very concrete policy initiatives that should be taken. In Iraq, it has to do with focusing on the center of gravity of the overall effort there, which is actually not on the front lines, though progress there has to continue. Without question, that's the military context that we might talk of, but that's not sustainable if you don't resolve the issues in Baghdad and Iraqi politics, which has to be inclusive, which have to bring the Sunni Arabs back into the fabric of society yet again, as we did during the surge, even as you are, again, obviously rolling back and pushing back the Islamic State, not just in Iraq, but also in Syria. With respect to Syria, clearly, there has to be a greater enabling and greater support for those opposition forces that would once again be inclusive. Again, there is a theme to this, and it is inclusivity. It is rejection of extremism. It's rejection of sectarianism. That has to be a feature in Syria, and again, we should support and enable those individuals, those forces even more.
But they've gone. There aren't any
They're
left.
not gone, actually. They are fighting.
How many are we
they are
talking
fighting right now. Well, I mean, news accounts. I'm not going to. News accounts certainly talk of many thousands, 10,000 perhaps in the north and the south. This is not the military train and equip program. There's been another effort, as you well know, and that has borne some fruit. They are, in fact, by the way, they are actually the target of the Russian strikes, which are predominantly in the Idlib area, just to the east of the Latakia enclave. They are supporting an offensive by the regime forces. They're not going after the Islamic State. There have been a few strikes out there. The bulk of them, they're elsewhere.
Sorry, with respect.
So again, you got to support these guys. And by the way, policy proposal, a safe haven that you say we're going to protect you and people can return to. It reduces the pressure on the refugee problem, and it demonstrates what is possible if security is provided.
That is a threat to a sovereign state that Assad simply will not accept.
Well, first of all, Bashar al-Assad is not part of the solution in Iraq or in Syria long term. This is not to say, well, I beg to differ. I think as long as he is there, there will be an incredibly powerful magnetic attraction of would-be jihadists and others that have seen what he has done to Sunni Arabs in that country, have seen the 250,000 Syrians killed, nearly half the population displaced externally or internally. So again, now, in fact, you heard the Russian representative, in a sense, explain, I think, in a very nuanced way, that there is a willingness to separate Bashar from whatever Syrian state might be left at some point in time, which is what the Russians are trying to protect and to preserve. He was losing. The momentum was against him. There was finally a military context that might have actually propelled him to the negotiating table. That now the effort will be to reverse that for all of the protestations of this is to promote dialogue and so forth. So we'll see there. But again, in each of these cases, there's a comprehensive approach that's necessary. They're exactly right. There's no military solution. But as you acknowledged up front, there is a military context that is necessary and without which nobody is going to negotiate anything.
Thank you, sir. Your Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Libya. There's going to be a need, isn't there, for a military context to provide any sort of solution in Libya going forward. I think we've tried everything. There is a clear date to which Berardino is working towards, which I think is probably not going to work so far as a solution, a UN-prescribed solution for Libya. So again, your thoughts?
Okay, I think your question relates to the need for manageable and orderly transitions. There has been, from our perspective, there has been an utterly wrong assumption that countries should be left alone to manage their own situation after decades of brutal and repressive regimes. Indeed, the international community, I have heard Bernardino before taking his assignment as the UN Special Representative. He spoke in July 2014 when he was the European Union representative. He was open about the failure of the international community in coming to terms with the transition that followed the fall of the Gaddafi regime. President Obama, at the opening of the General Assembly, was once again honest and candid about that. He admitted mistakes in Libya, but it was not the first time that he had said it. I think he deserves some praise for he's definitely commended for his honesty and transparency in this area. Security, as you said, is badly needed. Support in the areas of security. And there has been yet another fallacy that has asserted that the Iraqi army is the Saddam army, that the Libyan army is the Gaddafi army. So there has been a veto on the rebuilding of the national army in Libya. So indeed, security is of a paramount importance to rebuild Libya, Iraq, and the new Syria, hopefully soon. However, there should be a palette of measures that should be provided, that should be offered to states, not only security, but also some serious help in the area of national reconciliation. I would say that the UN between 2012, I used to work for the UN, so nobody is perfect, Becky. Indeed, there has been a failure on the part of the UN in the area of national reconciliation. We could have done better. However, Libya and the new emerging states from the so-called Arab Spring should be assisted in devising plans and strategies to curb security, definitely, but also to address education, health, and other badly needed areas that have not come through. Libya is a state where you have poor health services. Libyans under the Gaddafi regime, and up until now, they would go to Tunisia, to Jordan, to Egypt to seek health services.
Thank you for the time being. And we're going to talk about, I hope, changing the paradigm that is security equals stabilization equals human development, and perhaps talk about just how integral it is that this region starts talking about the economy equals stability equals human development going forward, and I think that's incredibly important for this panel. Philip, though, you wrote a fascinating article recently, It's Time to Rethink Syria. Can we take that a bit wider and say it's time to rethink this region? Where are the opportunities? And if you had one policy with a magic wand that you could enact at this point for this region, what would it be?
Thanks, Becky. Though I don't know why I'm the one who gets put on the spot with the one policy suggestion, but I'll try. Let me first take a step back in terms of it's time to rethink Syria. It's related to, in a way, the point of this whole conference. I think our chair, Regita, yesterday asked those panelists, is it possible to get on with everything we're trying to accomplish in this region? You mentioned health, education, institutions, so long as these conflicts are going on. And my answer to that question is no. There are a lot of creative ideas that have been discussed here about innovation and youth and society and companies, and all of these are exactly, obviously, what the region needs long term. But so long as we have a raging war in Syria, as well as Iraq, Libya, Yemen, I think those challenges are hard enough as it is. So long as you have a throbbing sectarian, civil, and geopolitical conflict going on, there is almost no chance to get on what the region needs to. And that's why, if you take it back to Syria, I think there is an overwhelming priority on stopping the war. Now, you talk about the article I wrote. What I said was events over the past several weeks, I think, underscore that the approach we have taken so far is not working and is unlikely to work. And what do I mean by events over the last several weeks? Obviously, the spillover of the refugee crisis into Europe is one. Now, all of us who follow this regularly have known that there has been a tragic and horrible refugee crisis for years. Europeans and some Americans have managed to overlook that because it was sort of statistics far away. But now it's visible that so long as this conflict is going on, it can't be contained, it can't be moderated, it is visible for everyone to see. On top of that, you have, speaking of visible things, you have the visible failure of the train and equip mission, which was an understandable effort, and we've all been supportive of efforts to support the opposition, but I think we see now how hard it is to train and equip a successful and moderate force, powerful enough to bring about change of a standing army backed by countries like Russia and Iran. It's just really hard to do, and I think really needs to lead us to question whether that approach is going to work. And then on top of that, you get the Russian intervention, which I agree with General Petraeus and others, is now, speaking of visible things, it is visibly designed to back the regime. It's not designed to go after ISIS. It is designed to keep this regime in power. And it is a response, in a way, to our efforts to boost the opposition. So when you put all of that together, it leads me to the conclusion that what we have been trying to do for several years, strengthen the opposition to the point that it brings the regime and its backers to compromise in some way by either giving up power or getting rid of Assad, is not on a path to success. On the contrary, it is on a path to perpetuate this war with all of the refugees and tragic consequences that go along with it.
It may be inconvenient to this region, but is it worth this region beginning to rethink whether they can deal with Assad going forward? Because if you now are in a position where it will be going forward Assad versus Daesh, if that is how we are reading the tea leaves with Russian intervention, is it not worth the rethink here? Because certainly from this region, there has been an effort to destabilize and get rid of Assad for a very long time, and it hasn't worked.
Yeah. So let me be clear about that question. I do not believe that there is a long-term solution with Assad. I agree with the general premise that so long as he is there, he will be a motivating factor for terrorists. So just to be clear about that. I do think, though, that the short-term political objective of making his short-term departure a prerequisite for any other steps to de-escalate the conflict needs to be rethought. Because, as I say, obviously that would be the ideal outcome, but it's one we've been pursuing for 4 years with less of a chance, I think, now of achieving than even a couple of years ago. So in that sense, I think it is worth exploring other measures in the meantime to de-escalate the conflict, even if his departure, on which we're going to disagree, probably forever, is put off for a later stage of the discussion.
Sorry, I know General.
Well, I'm not among those who, and I don't think there are too many rational people right now that want to literally just push Bashar out of the way and say, let what will happen. I think Syria could, as tragic and horrific as the situation is, could actually get worse. And frankly, so working through this, while there is still some coherence to the structure that is the rump Syrian state that's left, I think is important to acknowledge.
Sorry, go on.
I mean, what I would say, look, the Russians have come in, and we agreed, they've frankly come in to back the regime. Now, I would say to the Russians, if you think that that's the long-term solution here, if you just want to be the backer of the regime, bomb the opposition, and somehow expect that it will go away and everything will be fine and this won't turn into your Afghanistan, good luck to you. If, on the other hand, now that you feel that your core interests are protected, you've shown your presence, you've got your base, the regime is not going to fall catastrophically, you have as much of an interest in a political out here and a diplomatic out as we do. Now let's start talking about it. And ideally, it starts with you, now that you've protected your interests, getting rid of Assad so that we can preserve the institutions, de-escalate the conflict that way. That's how it should start. And it's not crazy to imagine that now that the Russians are there, they might actually be more open to an Assad departure track than they would have been if they weren't there, and therefore his departure would lead to the collapse.
And that was going to be my next question.
That's what it would start with, yeah.
Can we not actually imagine that there is a better outcome with Russian intervention here than perhaps we've all been talking about and speculating about over the last couple of weeks. Sigrid, you've done business with the Russians. You were involved in the removal of chemical weapons from Syria. You've done business with the Syrian regime to that degree in affecting the removal of those chemical weapons. So what is your back channel inside the Beltway sort of take on where Russia is and what its end game is here, bearing in mind that this is a region that does business with President Putin and may not want to make an enemy of him?
I'm not sure. Thank you, Becky. Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the forum live cast if I want to speculate on back channels. Where I'm seated from Beirut, I also maintain close relations with the Russians, both Moscow and of course in Beirut, as well as counterparts in Iran, Saudi Arabia, elsewhere. For me, it's as an outsider looking in, and with the Damascus experience, having indeed worked very closely with Moscow as well as Washington, because it was really a unique effort, the only part of the Syria file where at that time there was consensus in the Security Council and there was unity of purpose with actions that backed it up. So with that benefit of hindsight and the lifetime experience, I would see it also more as a potential opportunity to now be leveraged. And I think this is also where there's maybe scope, as the Deputy Secretary General yesterday said, for everybody to come around the table to say, we've all understood now, there is, however, a process, there is the Geneva communique, now more than ever is the time, if we do not want to lose Syria forever, because it's sometimes less about the superpowers or their interest or the regional partners. I think we have to put the people of Syria center stage. We know very little, and I think we had a Syrian representative in our policy circle yesterday who spoke very clearly of that. Have you asked us? Are you speaking to the right people? Where are we going with this? I mean, I think the imperative of ending the violence right now is clear, and the imperative for all, maybe a temporarily less finger-pointing for all to convene around the negotiating table is critical. Because the ramifications for the region are also known, and we see that. And we should get out of the comfort zone of always crying wolf over dealing with the symptoms. As a European, I am more than disturbed by the European response. As citizens, again, the xenophobia we see, the haphazard, unequal responses, but it's symptoms, and we don't go back to the root causes. And I think that is critical. Now, indeed, with the shift of time, we're looking at inadvertent consequences. The price of inaction is very clear in any conflict, but with the Syria crisis, I think the price of inaction and the deployment of our policy options at the right time has shown how grave a situation can be.
We all agree that the bloodletting must stop before there is a future. So, Karen, what happened to the Arab military force that was being touted back in Sharm el-Sheikh at the beginning of the year? I was at that meeting. I'm sure many of the delegates here will either have been there or were aware of that. What happened?
I think it's still under discussion, is my understanding, but maybe the Libya Foreign Minister is a better place to speak.
I'm just wondering, I'm just wondering about what its responsibility and role might be going forward. Anybody?
I think it's one of our frustration at this stage that we have started a process, as you rightly said, in March of this year. We have this process followed up on closely by the Arab League. The Army Staff Chief met extensively. They reached some conclusions, and we have had two failures. We had two meetings, one in July and one in August, on the Arab Defense Council, which is an emanation of the 1950 Joint Arab Treaty. But we haven't as yet met. We are given to understand that there are some differences, and I think we build high hopes in the Arab region to overcome these differences and challenges. Arabs have to take seriously their own fate and their own imperative of addressing the national security considerations and challenges that we are faced with.
Well, there's an Arab force that's fighting in Yemen right now.
And
it is creating, I think, approaching the military context at which the Houthis will be willing to come to the table, noting that the Houthis didn't get what they wanted at the table last time, and so they did it through force. And I think, hopefully, they have taken from this that probably was not the right approach, and they can sit back down at the table and have a rational conversation about the political structure and power sharing and so forth within Yemen.
Saudi-led coalition force, isn't it, to a certain extent?
It is, yeah. It is not the, quote, it's not the Arab force. It is a Saudi-led, but it has several other Arab nations. The Emiratis certainly are prominent in it. The Qataris are in it. The Egyptians are playing some role. There are other Gulf states that are active in various ways. And, of course, there is a coalition, if you will, that the U.S. is supporting with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that is relatively important as well.
Sorry, go on, Sigrid, and I want to get to the two chaps at the end.
Sorry. Step back. We're talking a lot, rightly, probably, or rather logically, again, about state violence or continued responses to extremism, to crises. I think we have to also take it a step back and see again what Arab leaders with their citizens can do in terms of preventive diplomacy, engagement, because we're always dealing with consequences. More force on top of force creates again the repercussions. I mean, Yemen is a humanitarian tragedy of one of the poorest Arab countries, already below any of the MDG future SDG indicators ever. Malnutrition, stunting, maternal mortality, 80% is internally displaced, and yet we talk about force. I understand the concept in international relations, yet I would also like to see a greater effort and support by the international community for Arab prevention, mediation, preventing conflicts, and indeed the investments that are needed, rebalancing of actual development of citizens, because that's ultimately the bigger and better security shield you can give. Any state can give itself and its citizens, and that's been the road not traveled, basically.
Sorry, General.
Well, this is the comprehensive approach that I was talking about earlier. This has to always be comprehensive. It just can't be military. In fact, what the military allows you to do in many situations is to make a few steps in these other areas, whether it's basic services, governance, or what have you, and that enables a little bit better security, so you're either spiraling upward or you are spiraling downward.
Actually, the experience in Iraq of late is not that military intervention just very recently has helped to improve the lot of the people. It's been the sacking of a corrupt and cronyistic government, I think, by the now Prime Minister, who has allowed for, one hopes, the betterment of the people through economic progress. Let me stop you there. Karim.
Is there a question?
No, it wasn't a question. It was just your name. Give me a solution. Give me a solution to this region's roiling problems at present. You've got a magic wand. The floor's yours.
All right. Well, let me start with a depressing observation, historic context, and then I'll talk about maybe a prescription. If we were having this conversation 4 decades ago, the group that was considered the most notorious terrorist organization in the world was the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. A decade later came Hezbollah, and it made the PLO look moderate. A decade after that came Al-Qaeda, and it made Hezbollah look moderate. A decade after that comes ISIS, and it makes Al-Qaeda look moderate. And so if you look at the trend lines in this region, it paints a pretty bleak picture of what the future could look like. I asked a friend of mine who has been working on these security issues for a long time, and I asked him what could be next. He said, ISIS, which can print WMD in the middle of the desert, using 3D printers. So I think that as General Petraeus and Phil and others have talked about, these radical groups fester in conflict zones. And I think one of the best lines of John Kerry's tenure as Secretary of State, he said that there's a symbiotic relationship between Assad and ISIS. So I think that absolutely there has to be a solution in Syria, and as long as you have Assad ruling in this refugee crisis, then we're talking about building homes in the eye of a tornado. Let me offer kind of a minor policy prescription, which is certainly it's addressing a symptom. It's not addressing the cause. But it's something I think about and I'm worried about a lot, which is we talk a lot about job creation in this region. We talk a lot about the need for IT jobs. I think one of the most needed professions in today's Middle East and in future generations are mental health professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, who can work with these 2-3 generations now who've been who've been dealing with horrific traumas. And when you see the drawings these young Syrian children draw in these refugee camps, you really worry about the future of this region, even if the Syrian conflict is resolved tomorrow or next week, the lasting trauma. So I would love to see, there's been so many wonderful universities created here in the UAE, NYU, Cornell, I know that Doha is building universities as well. I would love to see an institute created to train Arabic-speaking mental health professionals, because I think it's going to be a hugely needed profession in the coming decades.
I think that's a fantastic idea. Thank you. Khalid, we talked yesterday, or you talked yesterday on this stage, about real regional economic integration. How do you make that happen here? Are we talking a greater Arab free trade area? Are we talking an Arab customs union? What should be on the agenda in order to foster proper economic integration, which I agree with you, without that in this region, it will be very difficult to see a decent future?
I think those two things you mentioned, I think those are results rather than saying this is what we want. Let me start with what Karim said in his policy, and I like that, about the issue of mental hospitals and
Health
teaching. And as a
professionals.
matter of fact, I have an answer for that. We should clone Secretary Amr Moussa, 2 million of Amr Moussa, they'll be good enough to do that job. But I think I'll take an exception to your first question to the general, where it was about the Americans pulling out and the Iranians and the Russians filling the gap. That actually, as an Arab, as someone comes from this part of the world, I take it as an insult. And I think the regimes in this part of the world, the Arab world, they should take it as an insult too. They don't, because security-wise, they want the United States from a security perspective for the regimes, which in itself is creating a problem, which Karim spoke about the past 30 years, I'm not talking about the past 40 years, has been a way of anti-establishment coming through all these things because of that narrative. We don't talk about it much. We shy away from it. I'm not someone who condones democracy. I don't think democracy is maybe the right thing about here. However, at the same time, I take a real exception for people who in this part of the world saying that democracy is against our DNA. That's an absolute and utter racist comment to make. That is a way of really putting yourself down. Okay? We basically, our Khalifa, the second Khalifa, Amr ibn Khattab, he said something which is very important, that we've all been born free, and we should not slave or slave anybody. What's happening in our part of the world, that we are not free. Even when you find big guys coming to the UNGL last 2 weeks ago, when they talk on the stage from this part of the world, the Arab world, they don't say we, they say my people or our people at best. When they become a bit more sort of humble, they would say our people. But when they are what they feel, they say my people. That is unacceptable in today's world. Today, we are moving with the speed of sound in terms of technological advancement. What Sigrid said with regards to citizenry, that is the important thing. We need to start from there. We need to change things in order that we come for true economic development. We need to accept the other side. There must be a new social contract between the ruled and the ruled. There must be a new contract from the outside, how we deal with this part of the world. Are we dealing with the regimes, or are we dealing with the people? Every time I hear in the States, oh, this we do with this country, then you ask yourself a question, are you talking about the regime safety, or are you talking about the country's safety? These things, time has come that we put it on the table rather than just under the table. We are, the world, nobody is smarter than anybody else today. Everything is there and available. So we need to take advantage of that and really think about that aspect. Coming back to your question about where we're going from here, I think economic development is the important thing, and sustainability of that development is important. How many, I mean, 1,000 years down the road, people will say, it's not me saying it, but somebody might say, by the way, there was somebody called Prophet Jobs, okay? And there was a Prophet Gates. And to be honest, when you think about what they've done, and they are not Muslims, but I don't know what happens in next life, these two guys don't go to heaven. Something must be wrong. Because what they've done to this world in terms of advancement. We see everybody here, they've got their iPhones, they are into everything today. So we need to think a bit differently. We need to allow, we talk about innovation, we talk about entrepreneurship. I've really seen an entrepreneur in the real world where it's been good in succession planning. They are bad, very bad in succession planning. Majority of them. There are some exceptions. So to allow entrepreneurship, which I think is an important factor, you need to have the critical thinking. Yesterday, a few times, the word critical thinking came through. But critical thinking, the basic questions, and that it comes from a citizenry. We want real citizens. We want our citizens, you mentioned the word integrity, that our citizens, if they are, okay, all of us, we need to have dignity, and the dignity comes from respect. And respect comes that you can ask any question you want to ask. Even if it's the wrong question, you ask it. You should not be shying away or worried about asking the question. One problem we have in this part of it, and that's why we cannot solve things, is that we cannot ask those questions. We cannot rely on our people, okay? And there is an issue, I mean, general, without exception, talking about the Sunni majority. I hate the Sunni, Shiite, whatever. I mean, this war in Yemen, because the Omanis did not get through. Somebody, very intelligent friend of mine, a Saudi friend, he says, the Omanis did not get through because they are Abadis. And this might be a new word for some of you, but Abadis because they are closer to Iran than they are. That is nonsense in reality in the way we talk. We should be getting away from the sectarial discussion. The technology which is available, the satellites that we have in the Arab world, unbelievable. The incitement against each other, whether this sector, that sector, this creed or that creed, is unbelievable. So rather than pushing ourselves into positive energy and really thinking about where we're going to go from here by putting our hands together and taking us forward, we are always been so negative and doing bad. However, that is good news, because that means there is so much hope that we go forward, because with the youth that we have, the youth bulge, 15% unemployment, majority of us are under the age of 25 in the Arab world. There is a real, what I would call, and I hope for myself, you said something at the beginning, for myself, that we evolve towards that, where we get these young people to go forward. Keeping the status quo is not going to work. Having whatever regime, like in Egypt or whatever, that status quo like it used to be. Everybody was scared when Mubarak went. Rather than, I'm not saying Mubarak is good or bad, but everybody was scared. What is next? We should not be scared, especially the regimes. I mean, we should basically wait. I think His Highness yesterday said, let's talk, let's ask the Syrian people what they want. I would say, let's ask the Arab people, truly, do they want their security to be under United States or Russia or Iran or whatever? Iran, whether I like it or not, they are my next door neighbor. I prefer to sit with Iran directly rather than sitting through with General Petraeus sitting there or Kerry sitting there or whoever. With all respect, General, I prefer to deal with them directly rather than dealing through the Americans. I
think there was the fantastic youth survey actually done here, and it's done every year, and it pointed out that there are serious concerns about the Roiling region and terrorism in this region. But very quickly, when you ask the youth, and I never know who I'm talking about these days, I'm clearly not talking about myself, I think I'm talking about people 18 to 40 years old, right? People who are going to get on with things going forward when the rest of us are retiring our time. They say, terrorism, they realize that the region is a problem. But after that, it's about jobs, it's about technology, it's about the opportunities that might be provided not by governments here but by the private sector, and the efforts that should and could be made in order to open the private sector.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, something actually, when, call it what you want, the Arab uprising, or whatever it was, the Arab Spring. One thing that we suggested from the business community was that the best way to go forward is what you just mentioned, is that to create jobs will be the best solution going forward. And we created, basically, talking like Karim was saying, a specific advice. We gave advice, and actually without mentioning, 2 strong senators from the United States were involved in the discussion of this. That we said, the best thing is to basically put a fund together, managed by, through the US, $50 billion a year, for 4 years, that's $200 billion. Where the money comes from? Actually comes from the reserves of this part of the world. But it's guaranteed by the United States. It's over 25 years, and create jobs through, which is very, very infrastructure. Because the infrastructure requirement in Egypt, infrastructure requirements in all the other countries, and the countries such as Libya, Syria, Yemen, everywhere else, and Morocco, we need, by the way, around $3 trillion in the next 10 years of infrastructure in this from Morocco to Bahrain in terms of infrastructure work. Infrastructure creates big jobs, top jobs. And you need, in times of transition, to have those jobs. So that was mentioned. And when we came to real discussion, somebody raised the issue from the doning or the donor countries, saying, well, we don't know who's going to be in power in Egypt. If we trust them, we might do that. Now, that's the wrong attitude, because what if there is Egypt is secured in terms of job creation? With all due respect to everybody else and the regimes everywhere else, we will be secure, the rest of us, because if your neighbor is secured, you are secured. So that lack of understanding and just keeping the momentum of carrying on, 40 years of what Karim was saying, I want to keep the status quo to be where I am, the way it is, it's not going to work anymore. So there is a change, it's coming. It's better to come through evolution rather unfortunate revolution that we see.
Right. Interestingly, after this panel, I know there's going to be as many as 9 voices who are going to speak for a minute or so about what it is that they need from this region as youngsters in this region going forward. And I think that's a fantastic idea. 60 seconds each. I've read Muriel's one already, and I think it's brilliant. And it has to speak to where this, the confidence that, young people in this region need confidence that there is a bright future, because they are no different from youngsters I have met anywhere in the world where I have worked. Sigrid, you had raised your arm. I like this idea of a fund, of a GCC fund perhaps, or a wider remit for that. But you know, if that is a policy idea that comes out of this couple of days, then great. Go on.
Maybe 3 points and building on.
You can have any name you want.
You made a lot of points, so we'll pick up on all of them.
Actually, the data are there. A number of years ago, we convened a number of studies with actually AUB and national universities of the different countries of the MENA region around the youth agenda, aspirations, and really what they want and how to get there. The same for the knowledge economy. We're talking about critical thinking. You need to invest in a knowledge-based economy. What happens, the policy analysis is there, the data, the recommendations. There's a huge gap between the ability, particularly of the state sector, but also the private sector, to then follow it through. And I think we need to have greater drive. We need to have drastic reform of many state entities, but it's a long-term process. So the risk is the gap between the aspirations and the knowns versus the ability to transform very quickly part of the state apparatus you need to deliver, particularly for the most marginalized, is a key issue. But I think now a fund of this nature, but also renewed attention, can probably help that. The second one is, I think, is one of indeed citizens and identity. And I fully concur as a sort of person who's not from this region, but who's been fortunate to be in and out for 25 years. I think the whole artificial labeling of sectarian, Sunni, Shia, is only because it's a superficial appreciation we have. When all of your citizen identity has been eroded and has been oppressed to be only the reactive channel you've got left, i.e. part which is the religious group you belong to, then we've lost part of the game. But I think we shouldn't feed that, and we should communicate very differently. We're talking about people, individuals, and their agenda. And your agenda cannot be whether you're Catholic or Calvinist, or whether you're Sunni or Shia. Religion, identity has mostly been used to oppress and to manipulate and to channel. And it's usually not necessarily for a good cause. And I think so far in the region, people have always been either, they maybe have been Arabs, I'm an Iranian, I am a Kurd. Those are different parts of identity, and within that you are also of a religious origin. And I think it's our responsibility, internationally also, to not feed that frenzy, because it's unhealthy.
Interesting. No, I agree with you as well. Sorry, I'm going to come back to you, Philip. Let me just come to you, Your Excellency.
Yes, I fully agree with Sigrid about the need for a multifaceted strategy to curb terrorism. So it's not, the security is not the panacea, by all means, and I think General Petraeus has concurred with that. However, I would like just to fall back on Ahmed's point on the hatred discourse and the takfiri discourse that has prevailed, including some sectarian divide elements in it. I would like just to say that we have started a commendable effort. We have seen some first steps in the Al-Azhar, some other steps in Al-Alaween mosque, in the Alaween institution in Morocco. King Hassan VI has signed 1 month ago an agreement with President Hollande about the training of imams. Training of imams by the Alaween is ongoing in Africa. So I think I have a policy recommendation to support, because the Al-Azhar institution has been neglected for decades. We need some financial and political support for Al-Azhar. It's an institution, as it has been pointed out yesterday by Amr Musa, that indeed teaches the Ja'fari sect of Islam. It's also, I think, a very commendable and institution that has prevailed for decades in the Arab region. I would like to fall back on Iran and the inclusivity. By all means, we should include Iran in the Middle East political, social, and economic sphere. We should include also other families, such as the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups. We are called upon in reshaping the Arab region to promote inclusivity. We are for that. However, one must underscore that inclusivity should come with the need to respect the ballot votes. I have in mind Yemen and Libya. So violence and the challenge to the people vote is a serious concern for us in Libya and Yemen. And the international community has not come forward to support us adequately, politically. Militarily, now we have the Saudi-led intervention, but politically, I must say, as Libyan, we haven't been adequately supported by the international community, because the ballot votes, the people's votes didn't count in the equation that has prevailed so far.
I wonder whether you rely too much on the international community. Look at the Nobel Prize Committee awarding to Tunisia, who, off their own back and with support, have provided, I think we probably will all agree, a model of inclusivity going forward. Clearly it has its problems, clearly it has its incidents, clearly there is a Daesh element there which is very destabilizing for that country. But is there a parallel that can be drawn?
I commend Sweden for that.
I agree.
And I warmly congratulate the Tunisian people for the smooth and success they have just had. However, like in Libya, they are faced with a rising challenge, Daesh, terrorism. And we have seen so far a piecemeal approach, an incremental approach to fighting terrorism. We have an international coalition that should have been set up in 2012, 2013, in the early stage of the rising threats of Al-Qaeda and Daesh. We didn't have that in Syria and Iraq, but as we speak, we do not have any international effort in Libya or Tunisia to curb terrorism.
There are at least 3,000 foreign fighters who've left Tunisia. I think another 8,000 who were stopped from leaving. I can tell you, when I was there in, what was it, June now, covering the very, very terrible story of the slaughter on the beach, that most politicians that I spoke to there, of all creed and colour, told me that their biggest challenge, once again, was providing jobs, decent education for their youngsters, so that they wouldn't, providing an infrastructure, so that the knowledge economy would work. It comes back to time and time and time again, making sure that the politicians who are running the regions aren't corrupt, that cronyism isn't. It's a frustration of mine, I'm sure, a frustration of many people's in this region, that when it comes down to it, you will foment these cults, as it were, the Daeshes of this world, if you don't look after the social contract. It needs rewriting in some places.
Becky, if I may, I mean, we all commend our brothers in Tunis, and I'm talking about the people of Tunis. Because you know, as well as I do, that the quartet, actually, at the beginning, they were not inclusive. The only way that they could get to where they are eventually, they knew that there is no way out but to be inclusive, because they were not inclusive. So the Tunisians have done very well. But when we talk about social inclusiveness. 2002 UNDP report, everybody talks about it in the Arab world. And talks about it for two reasons. Because it came out, and because in 2003, George W. and, of course, Condoleezza Rice at that time, they started pushing down a lot of this and using the UNDP report that is done by the Arabs themselves, Arab thought people, that they brought this thing up. And one of the major things that they looked into there was the issue of the gender gap deficit. It was a big thing. And, of course, as a response, the Arab world, most of the countries of the Arab world, what did they do as a response to this? Because there was pressure. Suddenly, the First Lady became the most intelligent woman in the country, became the most progressive person in the country, and we just basically went back to status quo, with the First Lady being the top thing, with actually totally forgetting that the other 50% of the population in the Arab world, the amount of energy that they have and allowing them to do something. He gets upset with me sitting here, Amr Moussa. He said, because he was hitting the 50 people who put the constitution together in Egypt. And he was so proud that in one of the things there it says, minimum 25% of the seats in the parliament is for women. That's wrong. It should be maximum 25% of the seats for women because the men have got us into this problem. So we've got to be thinking more outside the box rather than inside the box. That's the solution. I bring the First Lady or the Second Lady to be the top person. That, unfortunately, in the future with the new people coming through, the young ones, that does not wash anymore. So it might wash with the likes of myself and the others, but it's not going to wash with the new generation. And the people at the top, they know this is not going to wash. And that's frustration that they have themselves, a fight from within. They have that. You don't see it, but it must be there because the world is changing, whether they like it or not.
Philip.
So let me make 2 points. We seem to be having these two parallel conversations. One about, again, innovation and job creation and employment in society, and then the other geopolitical and strategic. And they are intimately related. To come back to the point I made later, I don't see how you get on with that agenda so long as the conflicts are going on. There's not a country in the region that is not affected by these conflicts in a material way. You know, maybe the UAE and Qatar can more or less isolate themselves and get on with job creation and society, but just about every other country. In a material way through refugees, but also, to pick up the other point, in a sectarian way. Because these conflicts are both fueled by and fueling the sectarianism that will make it impossible to get on with building society and inclusivity and all of that. And you know, I've heard throughout this conference a number of complaints about this suggestion of Sunnis, Shia, but again, we have to be honest. These disputes have taken on a sectarian nature. And like I say, they are caused by, but they're also causing that increasing sectarianism. So you get back to sort of policy suggestions. You know, how about some leadership initiatives on trying to, instead of exacerbate that divide and pursue the conflicts through the prism of sectarianism, some form of dialogue or outreach to do the opposite. And of course, on both sides, the Sunni side and the Shia side, we've said, I think General Petraeus may have made the point, but I know we've agreed on this in the past, in Iraq, all the military power in the world is not going to resolve that conflict unless you get some form of outreach and inclusivity to the parties, primarily Sunnis and Kurds. And it goes in both directions. So until that is done, it seems to me that this other lovely agenda will be a theoretical one that we'll never get on with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Bill, frankly. And, you know, it actually took me back a little bit. I think we were in the second or third month of the surge. Violence was very, very high. As predicted, as I'd said, it did get worse before it got better. But I remember I'd get these calls from Washington and they'd say, well, Dave, when are they going to start passing legislation? You know, we got to get onto the political. I said, you know, with great respect, Mr. President, these folks are just trying to survive. I mean, they look forward to the day when they can actually take their kids to school and drop them off. They can't even get to the parliament, much less agree on legislation. So there is a certain foundational level of security that is absolutely vital and essential. And we should recognize there is a reality out there that security is going to be achieved in a world where certain people identify first and foremost at the survival level with a tribe, with a sect, with an ethnic grouping, or what have you. But what you have to do when you do get success and when you do get some security and a foundation of it, as we have seen in Tunisia, is you've got to help them make the most of it. Tunisia didn't have to. I mean, you made it sound as if it was predestined that they would ultimately agree after disagreeing that they would have to come together. Look, my hat is absolutely off to the Nobel Prize Committee, but more importantly, it's off to those who they selected, because these individuals didn't have to agree. Foremost among them, I think, we have to recognize that the Islamist party leader lost the election, and instead of, again, going to the streets or promoting violence or trying to overturn what the outcome of the ballot box, he decided that he would be a member of a government of national unity, in a sense a loyal opposition, and I think that was extraordinary. Now, the question, though, is how can you then build on that as quickly as possible? Because paradoxically, along with that success, the one Arab Spring country that has actually developed reasonably well, you have the highest per capita number of individuals going off to join Daesh and fight against Bashar al-Assad. And so obviously there's something missing, and that's the piece that we're talking, the comprehensive, all the rest of this. But when you get that security, you've got to be ready right away to try to capitalize on it, to solidify on it, and to build on it.
How far away is Libya from getting that sort of security at present?
Say it again?
How far away is Libya from getting the sort of security that David was just talking about?
There has been a prerequisite that has been put forward by the international community that we should get a government of national unity to get some support on security and fighting terrorism. So we are not yet there, but we are nearly there. There has been a commendable effort by, an international one by Bernardino Leon. We hope to get this agreement signed in the upcoming days.
Well, it's October the 20th, I think, is the deadline date, and that's a deadline that's been extended and extended and extended. I mean, I just once again feel sorry for the 25-year-old men and women who are trying to carve a life out in Libya at present, who just don't feel represented by either your government, quite frankly, or by the other government in Tripoli at present. We got 5 minutes. What do people want to do? Go on, Karen, go on. Sorry.
No, I actually wanted to say it's...
Karim first, sorry.
Okay. Maybe I'll be provocative to make up for my lack of airtime.
Sorry, Karim.
Well, I'll say this. Khalid used the term youth bulge, and I think youth bulge is the double entendre which best captures today's Middle East. You have the demographic bulge, and then you have these millions of young men who are unemployed. They can't get jobs, therefore they can't get married, and there's tremendous sexual frustration. It's a topic which all of us see in the countries we cover. No one can talk about it because it's a very sensitive topic. But this combination of political repression, economic malaise, and social repression is frankly a WMD. And all of these major Islamists, the thinkers dating back to Sayyid Qutb in Egypt, Khomeini, Bin Laden, and now ISIS, obsess about this issue. We've seen that ISIS has used sexual slavery as a recruiting tool. And I think that this combination, as I talked about, if we don't address it, it's going to continue to churn out young, unemployed, frustrated young men who join these radical groups.
Fascinating. Sigrid, you wanted the last thought?
No, I think we have to be very careful not to sort of get trapped by the security lens. I think it's not an either-or, and we have to look at the specificity.
I've never said it's either-or. That's why I use the image of spiraling up or down.
Let me finish, please.
Yep.
I think we have to be very specific to each country. There are many countries in the region that are not at war, where we can and have to accelerate the social investment and develop a social contract before it's too late. And the countries that are in war, in conflict, of course there is a three-pronged approach. But even within pockets of crisis, we can rebuild much faster than we think we do, because we can tend to be blinded. And the habit of the state in the Arab world definitely is security, security, security. Rule of law is absent. And that we have to invest in.
Yes.
You talk about articles in the media. There was an article a couple of days ago in the New York Times about the split of some countries in the Arab region, my country, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. I would like to fully disagree with that notion of disintegrating and fragmenting the Arab world. We are already fragmented and disintegrated by the chaos that has prevailed in some Arab countries. I sat recently in an African Union summit, and some African leaders said that the independence of South Sudan may have not been the right way to go about for curbing the violence and the political differences that had prevailed between Southern Sudan and Northern Sudan. I think it's an utterly wrong direction to go about, and it's not a policy direction that I would offer for this region.
Good, thank you.
I think the Iran issue, if I may, because it's not been discussed and it's part of the thing, I think we should take it as an opportunity, Karim, rather than a threat for it to come back. I'm talking from this part of the world. We've yet to do that, but I think that's going to happen regardless because of geography and history. We're going to do it. So it's important. However, I would like to say to Philip that, yes, security, whatever you want. Unfortunately, the reason we are where we are today, because of lack of meritocracy, lack of dignity for people, lack of allowing people basically to have a voice. That's why we are that way. So it's going to be the spiral thing. I'm sorry, General, it's going the other way around. So we need to think it's basically people first, their jobs, and their sex life, as Karim said, and everything else. That's important. That will create stability, which will create security.
I'm going to wind it up, guys. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.